March 23, 1945, Camp Swift, Texas. The mess hall fell silent as Sergeant Ida Louise Briggs carried a large covered platter through the double doors. 63 German women prisoners sat at long wooden tables, their gray auxiliary uniforms faded from months of wear, their faces bearing the careful neutrality they had learned to maintain since their arrival. They expected the usual fare: beans, bread, perhaps some chicken, if they were fortunate. What they did not expect was what Sergeant Briggs uncovered with a flourish that would change everything they believed about their captors. The cake sat on a white ceramic platter, its layers impossibly red against the cream-colored frosting. Not brown like the dark rye bread they remembered from home, not the pale yellow of rationed sponge cake from before the war. This was crimson, the color of fresh blood, of roses, of nothing any of them had ever seen on a dining table. 24-year-old Elfriede Zimmermann felt her breath catch in her throat. She had been a document specialist in Dresden, had processed hundreds of supply requisitions, had seen inventory lists from across occupied Europe. Never once had she encountered anything that suggested food could be this color. Beside her, 19-year-old Dorothea Werner gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. The young signals operator from Cologne had spent 3 years of war believing that Americans were cruel, wasteful, and morally corrupt. Yet here was proof of something she could not reconcile with that belief. The cake was beautiful. More than that, it was abundant. Layer upon layer of deep red sponge separated by thick white frosting, the whole thing large enough to feed every woman in the hall with slices to spare. Captain Francis Caldwell stood at the front of the room, watching the prisoners' reactions with careful attention. She had been camp administrator for 4 months and had learned to read the subtle shifts in these women's expressions. What she saw now was not hunger, though they were certainly hungry. What she saw was confusion so profound it bordered on pain. Sergeant Briggs began cutting the cake with a large knife, each slice revealing the shocking interior: 3 distinct layers of red separated by white, the contrast so vivid it seemed almost artificial. She placed the first slice on a plate and handed it to Brunhilde Meyer, the medical orderly who sat nearest the serving station. Hilda stared at the plate as if it might disappear if she blinked. Across the hall, Hedwig Kraus whispered in German to the woman beside her, "Is it real? The color? Is it real?" No one answered because no one knew. They had been taught that Americans were suffering just as Germans were suffering, that the war had brought deprivation to everyone equally. This cake, with its impossible color and its generous portions, suggested something different entirely. It suggested that everything they had been told might be a lie. 6 months earlier, on a cold November morning in 1944, 3 military transport trucks had rolled through the gates of Camp Swift, carrying the first group of female German prisoners to be housed at the Texas facility. The women had been captured in France and Belgium during the chaotic retreat of German forces, pulled from their posts as the Allied advance swept across Europe. They were radio operators, clerks, nurses, and administrative personnel who had believed they were serving in safe rear positions far from actual combat. Elfriede Zimmermann had been the last to step down from the first truck, her small leather satchel clutched against her chest. Inside were 3 photographs, a comb, and a single letter from her mother dated May 19, 44. She had received nothing since. At 24, she had spent 2 years managing supply documentation for Wehrmacht logistics in occupied France, believing she was contributing to Germany's defense. Now she stood in the Texas dust, surrounded by armed American soldiers, trying to understand how her world had collapsed so completely. The camp itself was smaller than the massive POW facilities housing German men elsewhere in Texas. A cluster of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers at each corner, and a central mess hall that looked newer than the other buildings. Captain Francis Caldwell had greeted them with a brief speech delivered through an interpreter, her tone professional but not unkind. The women would be housed separately from male prisoners. They would follow camp regulations. They would be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Dorothea Werner, standing beside Elfriede, had translated the captain's words for those whose English was weaker. Thea had studied languages before the war, had dreamed of becoming a teacher. Instead, at 16, she had been recruited into the Signals Corps, spending 3 years listening to radio communications and logging frequencies. She was 19 now, and she had not seen her family in Cologne for 2 years. The first night in the barracks had been tense. 63 women crammed into space designed for fewer, sleeping on narrow cots with thin blankets. They spoke in whispers, sharing what little information they had about American POW camps. Some had heard stories of harsh treatment, of prisoners being worked to exhaustion. Others insisted the Americans followed international law strictly. No one knew what to believe. Brunhilde Meyer, a medical orderly from Hamburg, had organized the women by age and skill, creating an informal hierarchy that helped maintain order. At 25, she was one of the oldest and had natural leadership qualities. Hedwig Kraus, 23 and always practical, had claimed a corner bunk and immediately began taking inventory of their collective resources. Between them, they had almost nothing. That first week, they had waited for cruelty that never came. The guards were distant but not hostile. The food was plain but adequate. And slowly, cautiously, the women began to realize that perhaps their expectations of American brutality had been shaped by propaganda rather than truth. Elfriede Zimmermann had always been the quiet one, even in Dresden. Her father worked as a municipal clerk. Her mother taught piano lessons to neighborhood children. They lived in a modest apartment near the Altstadt, where Elfie had grown up listening to church bells and watching boats on the Elbe. She had been good with details, with organizing information, with making sense of chaos. That skill had made her valuable to the Wehrmacht administration when they came recruiting in 1942. She had joined believing she was helping defend her homeland, never imagining she would end up in an American prison camp thousands of miles from everything she knew. Her hands were always busy. Even now, 3 weeks into captivity, she folded and refolded her single extra shirt, organized her few possessions with precise attention, kept her bunk area immaculate. It was the only control she had left. She wore her dark blonde hair pinned back severely, her gray uniform always buttoned to the collar despite the Texas heat. At 24, she looked older, the weight of responsibility and loss etched in the lines around her blue eyes. Dorothea Werner was different. Where Elfriede was reserved, Thea was animated. Where Elfriede processed emotion internally, Thea wore every feeling on her face. She had been the youngest in her signals unit, recruited at 16 with her parents' reluctant permission. Her mother had cried for days. Her father, a postal worker, had insisted it was safer than factory work, safer than the cities that were being bombed with increasing frequency. Thea had light brown hair that refused to stay pinned properly, escaping in wisps around her face. She was small, barely 5 feet 2 inches, with quick movements and quicker intelligence. She picked up languages effortlessly, had learned passable English within weeks of capture. Her role as informal translator gave her purpose, something to do besides sit and worry about her family in Cologne. The two women had met on the transport ship crossing the Atlantic. Elfriede had been seasick for most of the voyage. Thea had brought her water, held her hair back when she vomited, talked to her in low voices about inconsequential things to distract from the misery. By the time they reached American soil, they had formed the kind of bond that crisis creates, each recognizing in the other someone who might help them survive whatever came next. Brunhilde Meyer watched them both with the practiced eye of someone trained to assess patients. Hilda had spent 2 years working in a military hospital in Belgium, had seen young soldiers die from wounds that better supplies might have saved. She understood trauma, recognized it in the way Elfriede's hands never stopped moving, in the way Thea talked too much to fill silence. The first shock came during breakfast on their fourth day at Camp Swift. The prisoners filed into the mess hall, expecting the watery soup and hard bread they had grown accustomed to during their final months in occupied France. Instead, they found scrambled eggs, real eggs, piled on metal serving trays. Beside them sat sliced bread, white and soft, nothing like the dense black bread of home. There was butter, actual butter, and something the American cook called grits that none of them had encountered before. Elfrida stood in the serving line, her metal tray extended, watching as a large man in a stained apron scooped generous portions onto her plate. She wanted to tell him it was too much, that she could not possibly eat all of this, but her English was limited and her voice stuck in her throat. The portion was larger than what her entire family had shared for breakfast in Dresden during the last year she had been home. Thea, behind her in line, whispered in German, "They are trying to fatten us up, like livestock," but her voice held uncertainty rather than conviction. The American soldiers eating at their own tables across the hall had the same food, the same portions. This was not special treatment. This was simply how they ate. At their table, the women picked at their food with cautious suspicion. Hedwig Kraus was the first to take a full bite of eggs, her eyes widening at the taste of real protein, real fat, flavors she had almost forgotten. Within minutes, the entire table was eating, some quickly, others slowly, all of them struggling with the cognitive dissonance between what they were experiencing and what they had been taught to expect. Brunhilde Meyer, sitting beside Elfrida, ate methodically while observing the American staff. She had worked in hospitals long enough to recognize malnutrition, to understand what proper nutrition looked like. These Americans were not starving. Their cheeks were full, their movements energetic. They had not suffered the way Germany had suffered. The abundance continued at lunch, with thick vegetable soup and cornbread. At dinner, there was chicken, actual meat, prepared with seasonings that made Elfrida's mouth water, despite her determination to remain unmoved by American hospitality. Each meal was an assault on everything the women had believed about their enemy's deprivation and moral decay. By the end of the first week, the prisoners had gained noticeable weight. Their uniforms, which had hung loose on malnourished frames, began to fit properly again. Color returned to faces that had been gray with hunger and exhaustion. And with each meal, each generous portion, the foundation of their indoctrination cracked a little further. Private Woodrow Patterson, assigned to mess hall duty, watched the German women eat with something approaching satisfaction. His grandmother had always said, "You could not hate someone once you had broken bread with them." He was beginning to believe she might be right. Private Woodrow Patterson had grown up on a tobacco farm outside Knoxville, Tennessee, where his grandmother had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 7 years old. She was a formidable woman who quoted scripture and insisted that every person, regardless of where they came from, deserved to be treated with basic human dignity. When Woody had been drafted in 1943, she had made him promise to remember that the enemy soldiers were someone's sons and daughters too. He was 22 years old, tall and lanky with sun-bleached hair and hands calloused from years of farm work. The Army had assigned him to Camp Swift because of a knee injury that made him unsuitable for combat deployment. He worked in the mess hall, helped with supplies, and occasionally pulled guard duty. It was not the glorious service he had imagined, but his grandmother had written to say she was grateful he was safe. The German women made him uncomfortable at first. He had seen the newsreels about Nazi atrocities, had lost a cousin at Normandy. But watching them in the mess hall during those first weeks, he saw mostly young women who looked tired and scared and far from home. One in particular caught his attention, not because she was pretty, though she was, but because she never seemed to eat enough. Dorothea Werner always took small portions, always left food on her plate, always looked guilty when she ate. Woody recognized the behavior from his own experience during the Depression, when his grandmother had often gone without so he could eat. Thea was saving food, or trying to eat as little as possible out of some misplaced sense of not deserving sustenance. On a cold December morning, Woody waited until the breakfast service had ended, then wrapped 2 pieces of cornbread in a clean napkin. He approached Thea's table where she sat with Elfrida and several other women, his heart pounding with nervousness. He did not speak German, and his attempt at communication was clumsy, but he held out the wrapped bread and gestured for her to take it. Thea stared at him with wide eyes, confusion and suspicion warring on her face. Elfrida started to translate, to ask what he wanted, but Woody just shook his head and placed the bread on the table in front of Thea. Then he walked away before anyone could refuse it or make it into something more complicated than it was. The next morning he brought extra bread again, and the morning after that. Sometimes it was cornbread, sometimes biscuits, once a precious orange that the kitchen had received in a supply shipment. He never said anything, never expected thanks, just left the food and returned to his duties. His grandmother would have approved. She had always said that kindness did not require a shared language, that it spoke for itself. Other guards noticed and began their own small gestures. Extra blankets appeared on bunks during cold nights. A guard named Patterson brought English newspapers to the compound library. Sergeant Mitchell started teaching basic English phrases during evening recreation time. The atmosphere in Camp Swift began to shift from pure captivity towards something more complex, something that none of them quite knew how to name. December brought cold fronts that swept across the Texas plains, temperatures dropping to near freezing at night. The German women, accustomed to European winters, but unprepared for the dry cold of West Texas, huddled in their barracks with insufficient blankets and worn uniforms that provided little insulation. Captain Francis Caldwell noticed and requisitioned additional supplies, arguing with her superiors that the Geneva Convention required adequate heating and bedding regardless of the prisoner's nationality. Elfrida had stopped being surprised by these small mercies. Each one chipped away at the certainty she had once held about American cruelty. She found herself watching Captain Caldwell during daily inspections, studying the way the American officer spoke to her subordinates with respect, the way she addressed the prisoners with firm but fair authority. This was not the behavior of a morally corrupt enemy. This was leadership that reminded Elfrida uncomfortably of the better officers she had known in the Wehrmacht, the ones who had cared about the people under their command. The approaching Christmas holiday created tension throughout the camp. Some of the German women wanted to ignore it entirely, feeling that celebration was inappropriate for prisoners far from home. Others, particularly the younger ones like Thea, yearned for some acknowledgement of the season, some connection to the traditions that had once given their lives meaning and structure. Captain Caldwell wrestled with the decision for days. Local communities had complained about the camp being too lenient with enemy prisoners. Some American soldiers stationed at Swift felt that Germans did not deserve holiday considerations while American troops were still fighting in the Pacific. But Caldwell had seen enough of war to know that dehumanizing the enemy only created more hatred, more violence, more reasons for future conflicts. She announced her decision during morning assembly on December 15th. There would be a modest Christmas celebration. The prisoners could create decorations from available materials. There would be a special meal on Christmas Eve. Religious services would be permitted for those who wished to attend. Her words were translated by Thea, whose voice carried a tremor of emotion that betrayed her relief. The German women threw themselves into preparations with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone. Hedwig Krause, who had been a school teacher before the war, organized groups to create paper decorations. They cut snowflakes from scrap paper, folded origami stars from pages of old German newspapers, fashioned a small tree from pine branches that one of the guards brought from outside the camp. The activity gave them purpose, something to focus on besides their uncertain futures. Brunhilde Meyer helped organize a small choir, gathering women who could carry a tune and teaching them traditional carols. They practiced during evening recreation hours, their voices blending in harmonies that drifted across the compound. American guards would pause in their duties to listen, some recognizing melodies that transcended language and nationality. Elfriede found herself drawn into the preparations despite her initial resistance. She helped with decorations, contributed her clear soprano to the choir, and slowly allowed herself to feel something approaching hope. Perhaps she thought there was still goodness in the world. Perhaps not everything had been destroyed by the war. December 24, 1944, dawned clear and cold. Frost covered the ground outside the barracks, and the German women woke to find that someone had hung evergreen boughs along the exterior walls of their compound during the night. The scent of pine drifted through the air, sharp and clean, carrying memories of Christmases past, when the world had been different and war had seemed like something that happened to other people in other times. The mess hall had been transformed. Paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling, creating a canopy of white against the dark rafters. The small pine tree stood in the corner, decorated with handmade ornaments and strings of popcorn that American soldiers had contributed. Someone had found red ribbon, though where it came from remained a mystery, and it was draped along the serving counter in festive loops. Captain Caldwell had arranged for religious services in the morning, a brief ceremony led by a German-speaking chaplain from a nearby Army base. The women sang hymns in their native language, voices strong and clear, singing about peace on earth and goodwill toward men. Some cried, some simply closed their eyes and let the familiar words wash over them. Elfriede stood between Thea and Hilda, her hands clasped tightly, remembering Christmas services in Dresden when her mother would play piano for the church choir. But the true surprise came in the evening. The women filed into the mess hall for dinner, expecting a slightly better version of their usual fare. Instead, they found tables set with real plates instead of metal trays, cloth napkins that had been borrowed from somewhere, and centerpieces made from pine boughs and red ribbon. The American staff stood along the walls, dressed in their best uniforms, watching the prisoners with expressions that mixed pride and anticipation. Sergeant Ida Louise Briggs emerged from the kitchen carrying the first platter, roasted turkey, golden brown, and glistening with butter. Another server followed with mashed potatoes, then green beans, then rolls that were still warm from the oven. The women sat in stunned silence as plate after plate appeared, more food than they had seen in one place in years. This was not a modest improvement over regular rations. This was abundance that seemed almost obscene in its generosity. Thea began to cry quietly, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the food. She was not alone. Around the room, women wept openly, overwhelmed by the cognitive dissonance between what they were experiencing and what they had believed about their captors. This was the enemy. These were the people they had been taught to hate and fear, yet here they sat at tables laden with food, prepared by hands that showed them more kindness than their own country had offered in the final desperate years of the war. Private Woody Patterson stood near the kitchen door, watching Thea cry. His grandmother had written to him that morning, her letter full of prayers for peace and hope that someday the world would learn to see past its divisions. Standing here now, watching German prisoners weep over an American Christmas dinner, he thought perhaps his grandmother was wiser than he had ever realized. The meal had been consumed slowly, reverently, each woman savoring flavors and textures that belonged to a world before deprivation, and hunger had become normal. They had eaten turkey and potatoes and vegetables until their shrunken stomachs protested. Some had eaten past comfort, driven by primal fear that such abundance might never come again. Now they sat in satisfied exhaustion, the emotional weight of the evening settling over them like a blanket. Captain Caldwell stood to make a brief speech, her words translated by Thea, whose voice had regained its composure. The captain spoke about peace, about the hope that someday former enemies might become friends, about the shared humanity that existed beneath the uniforms and flags and national allegiances. Her words were met with solemn nods from the German women, some of whom were beginning to understand that their indoctrination had been built on lies. Then, Sergeant Ida Louise Briggs returned from the kitchen. The large black woman moved with confident grace, her white apron spotless despite hours of cooking. She carried a covered platter, and as she walked through the mess hall toward the serving counter, a hush fell over the room. Everyone sensed that something significant was about to happen, though no one could have guessed what. Sergeant Briggs set the platter down with ceremonial care. She looked out at the assembled German women, then at Captain Caldwell, then back at the prisoners. With a smile that transformed her round face into something luminous, she lifted the cover. The collective gasp that followed was instantaneous and visceral. The cake sat before them in impossible glory. 3 layers of deep crimson sponge, each separated by thick cream cheese frosting that gleamed white under the mess hall lights. The color was so vivid, so unexpected, so completely outside anything they had experienced during years of rationed existence that for a long moment no one could speak. They simply stared. Elfrida felt her breath catch. She had processed thousands of supply documents during her time with Wehrmacht logistics. She had seen inventory lists from across occupied Europe, had tracked food shipments and material allocations with meticulous precision. Never, not once, had she encountered any reference to food that was this color. Her mind struggled to categorize it, to find some framework for understanding what she was seeing. Beside her, Thea whispered in German, "Is it real?" Her voice held childlike wonder mixed with adult suspicion. The color! How is that possible? Around the room, similar whispers erupted. Hedwig Kraus, always practical, asked if it was safe to eat. Brunhilde Meyer, with her medical training, wondered what substance could create such coloring. The older women looked skeptical, suspicious of this strange American creation. The younger ones looked mesmerized, drawn to the beauty of something so frivolous and unnecessary and purely aesthetic in a world that had forgotten such luxuries existed. Sergeant Briggs began cutting the cake with a large knife, each slice revealing the internal architecture of crimson and white. She placed the first piece on a china plate, another unexpected luxury, and handed it to Captain Caldwell. The captain took a bite, smiled, and nodded her approval. Only then did Sergeant Briggs begin serving the prisoners. The slice sat on the plate in front of Elfrida like a small miracle. She had been served first among the prisoners, perhaps because she sat closest to the serving station, perhaps by random chance. The crimson layers seemed to glow against the white china, cream cheese frosting pooling slightly at the edges where it met the plate. She could smell vanilla, could detect hints of cocoa beneath the striking color, could see the fine crumb structure of properly made cake. Her hands trembled as she picked up the fork. Around her, other women were receiving their own slices, each one identical in its generous portion, each one representing abundance so foreign to their experience that it seemed almost obscene. Thea beside her had not yet touched her fork, simply staring at her plate with an expression that mixed wonder and something approaching grief. Elfrida took the first bite. The texture was impossibly light, tender in a way that rationed, wartime baking could never achieve. Real butter, real sugar, real eggs, all combined in proportions that spoke of a nation that had never known true deprivation. The cream cheese frosting melted on her tongue, sweet and rich, and completely unnecessary for survival, which somehow made it more precious than any practical food could ever be. She began to cry. The tears came suddenly, unexpectedly spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had maintained her composure through capture, through transport across the Atlantic, through months of imprisonment. But this cake, this ridiculous, beautiful cake, broke something inside her that had been holding firm against reality. She thought of her mother in Dresden, if her mother was still alive, if there was still a Dresden to return to. She thought of the last Christmas before the war, when her family had scraped together enough ingredients for a simple stollen, how proud her mother had been of that modest achievement. She thought of the years since then, the steady degradation of quality and quantity, the way hunger had become so normal that they had stopped noticing it until it was too late. This cake represented everything Germany had lost. Not just the material abundance, though that was part of it, but the luxury of creating something purely for beauty and pleasure, the freedom to waste resources on unnecessary color, on decoration, on joy for its own sake. German wartime baking had been about survival, about stretching rations, about making do. This American cake was about celebration, about excess, about a nation that could afford to make food red just because it looked beautiful. Thea was crying too now, and Hedwig and Brunhilde and half the women in the hall. They ate and cried, tasting sweetness they had forgotten existed, confronting the reality that their enemy had suffered so much less than they had. The propaganda had told them America was weak, decadent, on the brink of collapse. But this cake told a different story. It spoke of strength through abundance, of victory through resources, of a nation that could feed its prisoners better than Germany could feed its own citizens. January 1945 brought the first mail delivery for the German prisoners. The International Red Cross had been working to establish communication channels between POWs and their families in occupied Germany, and after months of bureaucratic processing, letters began arriving at Camp Swift. Not many at first, just a handful for the most fortunate women whose families had survived and somehow managed to get messages through the chaos of the collapsing Reich. Elfriede received nothing. She had written 3 letters to her parents in Dresden through the Red Cross system, carefully worded messages that said little of substance but conveyed that she was alive and well. She had received no response. With each mail delivery that passed without her name being called, the knot of dread in her stomach tightened. Silence from Dresden could mean many things, most of them terrible. Thea received a letter from her aunt in a village outside Cologne. Her parents and younger brother had evacuated the city months earlier when the bombing intensified. They were alive but struggling. Food was scarce. Fuel was nearly impossible to obtain. Her brother had been conscripted at 16 and was somewhere on the Eastern Front. Her aunt wrote in careful language that suggested things were far worse than the censored words indicated. The letter was dated November, and Thea understood that conditions had likely deteriorated significantly since then. Brunhilde Meyer's letter came from a cousin who worked as a nurse in Berlin. The news was devastating. Hamburg, where Hilda's family lived, had been virtually destroyed by Allied bombing raids. Her parents were confirmed dead, killed in the firestorms that had consumed entire neighborhoods. Her younger sister's fate was unknown. The cousin wrote with professional detachment that barely concealed her own trauma, describing hospitals overwhelmed with casualties, orphanages filled with children who had no one left, a city that barely functioned as anything recognizable as civilization. The letters painted a picture of Germany that contradicted everything the women had believed during their service. They had been told that the home front was strong, that civilians were resilient, that Germany was winning the war through superior will and determination. Instead, they learned of starvation, of cities in ruins, of a population pushed beyond endurance. The contrast with their own situation at Camp Swift, where they ate regular meals and slept in heated barracks, was stark and painful. Hedwig Krauss, who had received no letter but had read others that were shared among the prisoners, sat in the barracks one evening and voiced what many were thinking. "We are eating better here as prisoners than our families are eating at home as citizens. What does that say about our country? What does that say about what we were fighting for?" The question hung in the air unanswered. They were beginning to understand that they had been on the wrong side, not just militarily, but morally. That their service, however well-intentioned, had supported a regime that cared more about ideology than about the welfare of its own people. The revelation was crushing. April brought spring to Texas and horror from Europe. As Allied forces advanced into Germany, reports began filtering back about what they were discovering. The American newspapers that Sergeant Mitchell brought to the camp library carried front-page stories with headlines that seemed too terrible to be true. Photographs accompanied the articles, grainy black and white images that showed scenes from places called Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. Elfrida sat in the library with a newspaper spread before her, her hands shaking as she read the English text that Thea translated in a hollow voice. The words seemed impossible. Concentration camps, systematic murder, gas chambers, bodies stacked like cordwood, survivors so emaciated they barely appeared human. The scale of it, the industrial efficiency of it, the deliberate cruelty of it, all described in matter-of-fact journalistic language that made it somehow more real and more horrifying. She wanted to believe it was propaganda, Allied lies designed to justify the destruction of Germany, but the photographs were too detailed, too numerous, too consistent across multiple sources, and deep in her heart, she remembered small things that had not made sense at the time. Whispered conversations that stopped when she entered rooms, transport schedules that she had processed without questioning their purpose, requisitions for supplies that had seemed oddly specific. She had not known, had not wanted to know, had chosen the comfortable blindness of willful ignorance. Around her, other German women gathered to read the newspapers. Their reactions ranged from shock to denial to devastation. Some insisted it had to be exaggeration, that wars always produced atrocity propaganda. Others, particularly those who had served in occupied territories, began to remember things they had dismissed or ignored, small cruelties they had witnessed, disappearances they had not questioned, the gradual dehumanization of entire populations that they had accepted as normal wartime policy. Thea was crying again, but these were different tears than she had shed over cake. These were tears of shame and horror. She had been so young when she joined the Signals Corps, barely 16, still believing that war was something noble and necessary. Now at 19, she was old enough to understand complicity, to recognize that ignorance was not the same as innocence. She had worn the uniform of a regime that had committed atrocities beyond her ability to comprehend. Brunhilde Meyer stood at the window staring out at the Texas landscape. As a medical professional, she understood the implications better than most. The camps had not been improvised cruelty. They had been planned, organized, supplied through the same logistic systems she had tangentially supported. People with training like hers had participated. Doctors had conducted experiments. Nurses had administered lethal injections. The betrayal of medical ethics was complete and systematic. That night, the barracks were silent except for the sound of women weeping. They wept for the victims. They wept for their country's crimes. They wept for their own naive complicity. And they wept because they now understood that they could never return to the Germany they had left. That country no longer existed, if it had ever truly existed at all. The weeks following the liberation of the concentration camps were the darkest period at Camp Swift. The German women moved through their days in a fog of grief and shame. Some stopped eating, unable to reconcile sitting down to abundant American meals while learning about the starvation their country had deliberately inflicted. Others withdrew completely, speaking to no one, staring at nothing. The suicide watch that Captain Caldwell instituted was not precautionary, it was necessary. Sergeant Ida Louise Briggs watched the deterioration with concern. She understood something about carrying the weight of ancestral crimes. Her own grandparents had been enslaved in Mississippi, had survived horrors that were never fully spoken about, but always present. She knew that guilt could be either destructive or transformative, depending on what you did with it. These German women needed purpose, needed a way to transform their shame into something constructive. She approached Captain Caldwell with a proposal. Let her teach baking to any prisoners who were interested. give them something to do with their hands, something to create rather than destroy. Food had always been her language for communicating care and dignity. Perhaps it could serve the same purpose for women who desperately needed to find some way forward. The captain approved, and Sergeant Briggs put up a notice in the barracks. Baking lessons, voluntary, 3 afternoons per week in the mess hall kitchen. She expected perhaps 5 or 6 women to show interest. Instead, 23 signed up, including Elfrida and Thea. They came seeking distraction, seeking purpose, seeking any activity that might quiet the voices in their heads that whispered accusations about complicity and guilt. The first lesson was basic bread. Sergeant Briggs demonstrated measuring flour, explained the chemistry of yeast, showed them how to knead dough properly. She spoke in English, with Thea translating, but increasingly the language barrier mattered less. Baking was tactile, visual, a craft that transcended words. The women learned by watching, by doing, by feeling when the dough was right. Elfrida discovered she had an aptitude for precision that translated well to baking. Her years of processing supply documents had trained her to follow instructions exactly, to measure carefully, to maintain consistency. She found peace in the repetitive motion of kneading, in the transformation of simple ingredients into something nourishing. For a few hours each week, she could focus on flour and water and salt instead of on the horrors she had learned about. Thea was less precise, but more creative. She experimented with shapes, with braiding dough, with finding ways to make basic bread beautiful. Sergeant Briggs encouraged this, showed her how decoration was not frivolity, but an expression of care. When you make food beautiful, she explained, you are saying that the people who will eat it are worthy of beauty. You are saying they matter. The lessons expanded beyond bread. They learned biscuits and rolls and eventually simple cakes. Nothing as elaborate as red velvet yet, but building blocks toward that kind of achievement. And as they learned, they talked. About their lives before the war, about their hopes for whatever came after, about how to live with knowledge that could not be unknown. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The announcement came over the camp loudspeakers just after breakfast. Captain Caldwell's voice carrying across the compound with news that the war in Europe had officially ended. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The Reich that the women had served no longer existed. They were prisoners of a defeated nation, and the question of their future could no longer be postponed. The German women received the news in silence. There was no celebration, no relief, only a hollow understanding that everything they had known was gone. Some had expected this outcome for months, watching the steady deterioration of German military fortunes through newspaper reports. Others had clung to desperate hope that somehow Germany would prevail, that their sacrifices would mean something. Now they all faced the same reality. They were citizens of nothing, soldiers of an army that had been dissolved, servants of a regime that had committed atrocities beyond comprehension. Repatriation procedures began immediately. The War Department issued orders to all POW camps across the United States regarding the processing and return of German prisoners. Male POWs at other facilities were being organized into transport groups prepared for the journey back to occupied Germany, where they would be released into a landscape of devastation and military government. The assumption was that the women at Camp Swift would follow the same path, that they would want to return home despite the uncertain conditions they would face. But home was a complicated concept now. Elfrida had finally received news about Dresden through the Red Cross. The city had been destroyed by massive Allied bombing raids in February. Tens of thousands had died in the firestorms that consumed the historic city center. Her parents' neighborhood no longer existed. Whether her mother and father had survived was unknown. The Red Cross report was clinical in its devastation, listing casualty estimates and describing refugee movements without offering hope or comfort. Thea's family was alive, but displaced. Her parents had fled Cologne to stay with relatives in rural Bavaria. Her brother had surrendered to American forces on the Western Front and was in a POW camp somewhere in France. Her aunt's latest letter painted a grim picture of post-war Germany. Cities in ruins, transportation systems destroyed, food scarce, currency worthless, the black market, the only functioning economy. The other women faced similar situations. Brunhilde Meyer had no family left to return to. Hedwig Krause's parents were alive but elderly and living in the Soviet occupation zone, which seemed increasingly hostile and isolated. Throughout the barracks, conversations turned to the same question over and over. What were they returning to? What did Germany even mean anymore? They discussed it late into the nights, lying in their bunks, speaking in low voices about fears and uncertainties. Some felt duty-bound to return, to help rebuild their country no matter how difficult the circumstances. Others felt that Germany had betrayed them so completely that they owed it nothing. A few began to voice what had been unthinkable months earlier. What if they did not return at all? What if they found a way to stay in America, to start completely new lives far from the ruins of everything they had known? May 23rd, 1945. Captain Caldwell called a general assembly for all German prisoners to announce official repatriation procedures. The women gathered in the mess hall, 63 faces reflecting months of transformation and weeks of agonizing contemplation. They had been talking among themselves, forming tentative alliances, testing ideas that seemed too audacious to speak aloud. Now they would learn the timeline for their return to Germany, and some of them had decided they could not remain silent about their desires. Captain Caldwell stood at the front of the hall with official documents from the War Department. Her expression was professional, but not unkind as she began to speak, her words translated by Thea, whose voice carried only the slightest tremor. Transportation would be arranged within 3 weeks. They would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to whatever remained of their homes. The procedures were clearly defined, the bureaucracy well organized, the assumption being that all prisoners would naturally want to return to their homeland now that the war had ended. What Captain Caldwell did not expect was what happened next. Elfriede Zimmermann stood slowly, her hands visibly shaking despite her attempt to project calm authority. She had been chosen as spokesperson for a group that had met secretly over the past 2 weeks, women who had reached a conclusion that seemed insane and yet felt like the only rational choice available. In careful English that she had practiced repeatedly, she addressed the captain directly. "Captain Caldwell, may I speak for some of us?" Her voice was steady despite her racing heart. Permission was granted with a puzzled nod. Elfriede looked around at her fellow prisoners before continuing. "We have been talking among ourselves for many days. Some of us do not wish to return to Germany immediately. We would like to request permission to remain in the United States if such a thing is possible." The words hung in the air like something tangible and shocking. American guards exchanged confused glances. Some of the German women who had not been part of these discussions looked horrified at the suggestion. Captain Caldwell stood frozen, temporarily speechless, trying to process a request that had no precedent in her military experience. Prisoners of war did not ask to remain in captivity. They did not voluntarily choose to stay with their enemies rather than return to freedom in their own countries. Dorothea Werner stood next, followed by Brunhilde Meyer, then Hedwig Krause, then 11 other women. 15 in total, they formed a small group within the larger assembly, their decision clearly made after long deliberation. Thea spoke in halting English, her words carrying the weight of impossible choices and desperate hope. "Captain, we know what we are asking is very unusual, but Germany is not our home anymore. The Germany we served, we discovered. It was not the Germany we believed in," Elfriede continued, her voice gaining strength. "Here we have learned what it means to be treated with dignity even as enemies. We have seen kindness where we expected cruelty. We have been given the chance to work, to contribute, to become better people than we were when we arrived." The mess hall erupted in heated German conversations as soon as Captain Caldwell dismissed the assembly to consider the unprecedented request. Women who had lived together for months suddenly found themselves divided by an invisible line that separated those who would stay from those who would go. The debate was passionate, painful, and revealed fundamental differences in how they understood duty, identity, and redemption. Martha Schneider, a 32-year-old former administrative supervisor from Munich, stood to voice what many of the older prisoners were thinking. This is cowardice disguised as principle. Germany is defeated, yes. Germany has committed terrible crimes, yes. But that is exactly when Germany needs us most. Running away to America because life is easier here is abandoning our responsibility to help rebuild what was destroyed. Elfriede listened with respect but did not waver in her conviction. She understood Marta's argument, had made it to herself countless times during sleepless nights. I am not running from responsibility. I am accepting a different responsibility. If I return to Germany, I will be one more hungry mouth in a destroyed country. Here, I can work, I can contribute, I can show through my life that Germans are capable of change and growth. The debate continued for hours, first in the mess hall and then in smaller groups throughout the barracks. Some arguments were practical. Those who wanted to stay pointed out that they had no homes to return to, no families waiting, no prospects in a destroyed economy. Those who wanted to leave argued that family was more than just parents or siblings, that the German people as a whole were their family and needed every able person to help rebuild. Other arguments were philosophical. Hedwig Krauss, who had decided to stay, spoke about the impossibility of serving a country whose values she no longer recognized. I wore the uniform believing I was defending civilization. I learned that I was defending barbarity. I cannot pretend that did not happen. I cannot go back and live among people who will expect me to simply forget what our country did. But Greta Hoffmann, a 26-year-old who had decided to return, countered with equal passion. The people who committed those atrocities were a minority. Most Germans did not know, just as we did not know. Are we going to abandon an entire nation because of the crimes of its leadership? Are we going to let the Allied occupiers decide what Germany becomes without any input from Germans who have learned from this catastrophe? Private Woody Patterson, listening from his post near the door, was struck by the complexity of their dilemma. He had initially assumed that freedom was always preferable to captivity, that anyone given the choice would naturally choose to go home. Now he understood that these women were not choosing between freedom and captivity. They were choosing between two different kinds of exile, two different forms of belonging, two different visions of who they could become. The final count stabilized at 15 women who wished to stay and 48 who would accept repatriation. Captain Caldwell's urgent message to Washington received a response within a week, faster than anyone had expected. The War Department would not prevent voluntary repatriation of any prisoner who wished to return immediately. However, given the unusual circumstances and the ongoing chaos in occupied Germany, those who wished to remain could be reclassified as displaced persons and processed for potential immigration status under existing refugee provisions. It was a bureaucratic solution to an unprecedented problem, and it opened possibilities that none of the women had dared to imagine. But the decision came with significant conditions. The women would no longer be prisoners of war, which meant they would no longer be guaranteed housing and support at Camp Swift. They would need to find American sponsors willing to vouch for them, secure employment to support themselves, and locate housing in communities willing to accept former enemy nationals. It was in many ways a more daunting prospect than simply returning to Germany and facing whatever they found there. The announcement caused 3 of the 15 women who had initially requested to stay to reconsider. The uncertainty was too great, the barriers too high, the possibility of failure too real. They chose repatriation instead, deciding that familiar devastation was preferable to unknown challenges. But 12 women, led by Elfrida and Thea, chose to accept the risk. They would stay and build new lives in America or die trying. The process of finding sponsors proved surprisingly manageable. Word of the German women's unprecedented request had spread beyond Camp Swift to nearby communities. Local newspapers had picked up the story, some treating it as a curiosity, others as an inspiring tale of redemption and second chances. Church groups, civic organizations, and individual families began reaching out to camp officials offering assistance. The Henderson family from Austin contacted Captain Caldwell within days of the announcement. Thomas Henderson was a professor of languages at the University of Texas. His wife, Margaret, taught high school. They had followed the story of the Camp Swift prisoners with interest and were moved by Elfrida's obvious intelligence and her rapid mastery of English. They offered to sponsor her, providing housing in a converted garage apartment behind their home and helping her find work as a translator. Dr. Robert Hayes, who had been so impressed with Brunhilde Meyer's nursing skills, arranged for her to continue medical training at a hospital in San Antonio. He promised to supervise her transition from assistant to certified nurse, vouching for her character and commitment despite the complications of her German nationality. The hospital administrator, initially skeptical, was convinced by Dr. Hayes's passionate advocacy and Hilda's obvious competence. Sergeant Ida Louise Briggs made an unexpected offer to Dorothea Werner. Her sister owned a bakery in Houston and needed reliable help. Thea had shown real talent during the baking lessons, and Sergeant Briggs believed she could develop that talent into a viable career. The arrangement would provide both employment and housing, giving Thea a stable foundation for building her new life. Other local families stepped forward with similar offers. The same communities that had initially been suspicious of having German prisoners nearby now embraced the opportunity to participate in what they saw as a uniquely American story. Redemption, second chances, the possibility of former enemies becoming productive citizens. It appealed to their sense of national identity and moral purpose. June 20th, 1945. The morning arrived with unusual clarity. The Texas sky pale blue and cloudless, the air already warming despite the early hour. The scene at Camp Swift bore little resemblance to typical prisoner repatriation procedures at other facilities across the United States. Instead of tense, formal processing of defeated enemies being returned to their homeland, the atmosphere resembled something closer to a community farewell gathering, bittersweet and complex in ways that defied military protocol. The 48 women who had chosen repatriation stood in loose formation near the transport trucks that would carry them to the port in Galveston. They wore their gray auxiliary uniforms, cleaned and pressed for the journey, but their military bearing had softened considerably over the months at Camp Swift. They carried letters from American soldiers, photographs from their time at the camp, and small gifts that had been given to them by guards and staff who had become something more than captors. More importantly, they carried a different understanding of what America represented. Captain Caldwell stood before them, her voice steady but carrying emotion that military training could not completely disguise. "You came here as our enemies, but you leave as something we never expected, as friends. I hope you will remember that Americans can show mercy without forgetting justice, and that redemption is possible even in the darkest times." Elfrida, now serving as unofficial spokesperson for those remaining, stood to respond. Her English had become fluent and confident over the months, losing much of its hesitant quality. "Captain Caldwell, we came here believing we knew what America was. We learned that we knew nothing. We thought Americans were our enemies. We discovered that the only real enemy was our own ignorance and hatred. Some of us are staying, some are leaving, but all of us are changed." The 12 women who were staying watched their friends board the transport vehicles. Tears were shed on both sides, embraces exchanged between women who had supported each other through months of captivity and transformation. Thea clung to Martha Schneider, the older woman who had argued so passionately for returning to help rebuild Germany. They had disagreed about the right choice, but they understood each other's reasoning. Both paths required courage. Both paths involved sacrifice. Brunhilde Meyer stood with her arm around a younger woman named Petra, who was returning to search for her sister in the ruins of Hamburg. They had worked together in the medical facility, had shared long conversations about duty and redemption. Hilda pressed a small notebook into Petra's hands, filled with medical notes and observations. Take this. Use it. Help people heal. That is how we make amends. As the trucks pulled away, the women remaining at Camp Swift stood watching until the vehicles disappeared from view. They were no longer prisoners. They were no longer quite German. They were not yet American. They existed in a liminal space between identities, between nations, between the people they had been and the people they hoped to become. The choice had been made. Now they would discover whether it had been the right one. 25 years later, in 1970, Elfriede Zimmermann Patterson stood in her bakery in Austin, Texas, preparing a special order for a German-American Cultural Society event. The bakery had been her dream for a decade, finally realized 3 years earlier with a small business loan and the encouragement of her husband Thomas, the son of the family who had first sponsored her. The shop specialized in both German and American baked goods, a fusion that reflected her own complicated identity. She was 50 years old now, her dark blonde hair showing distinguished threads of gray, her English flawless except for the slight accent that would never quite disappear. She had 2 children, both born in America, both growing up with stories about their mother's journey from enemy prisoner to citizen. They knew about the red velvet cake, about the kindness of strangers, about the difficulty of choosing between 2 homelands. Today she was making red velvet cake for the Cultural Society dinner where she had been invited to speak about reconciliation and the immigrant experience. As she measured cocoa powder and red food coloring, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of decades of baking, she thought about how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. Dorothea Werner owned a successful bakery in Houston, her business thriving in a city that had embraced her talent and work ethic. Brunhilde Meyer had become Dr. Brunhilde Meyer, a respected nurse administrator who had returned to Germany in the 1960s as part of a medical exchange program. She had written to Elfriede describing a country transformed, rebuilt, not just in infrastructure but in values, committed to democracy and human rights in ways that would have seemed impossible in 1945. The women who had chosen repatriation had played their own crucial roles in Germany's reconstruction. Several had become leaders in German-American friendship societies, working to strengthen bonds between former enemies. Their stories of American kindness had helped convince other Germans that reconciliation was possible, that former adversaries could become genuine partners. As Elfriede assembled the cake layers, spreading cream cheese frosting between the crimson sponge, she reflected on the moment that had changed everything. That Christmas evening in 1944, when Sergeant Ida Louise Briggs had presented an impossible color on a plate. The cake had been more than dessert. It had been a message about abundance versus scarcity, kindness versus cruelty, the possibility of beauty in a world that had forgotten such things mattered. She had learned that home was not just geography or language or shared history. Home was where you chose to build a life that honored the best in human nature rather than the worst. It was where you found people willing to see past your mistakes to recognize your potential for growth. It was where you could transform shame into purpose, guilt into contribution, the weight of the past into hope for the future. The red velvet cake sat finished on the counter, layers of crimson and white, exactly as she remembered from that transformative night 25 years earlier.